This is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Live from London, this is The World Today.
Hello, I'm Robin Dwyer. Welcome to the programme. Our top stories. Second election looms for Greece as Prime Minister Kyriakos Mitsotakis wins Sunday's general election but fails to secure a majority. Ukraine says its troops are encircling Russian forces in the centre of besieged Bakhmut as both sides continue to claim control of the city. Facebook owner Meta is hit with a record $1.3 billion fine for transferring user data from Europe to the United States. And
hello from outer space. It feels amazing to be viewing Earth from this capsule.
Crossing the final frontier, Saudi's first female astronaut arrives at the International Space Station. Greece's Prime Minister says he won't form a coalition after his party won a commanding victory in Sunday's general election. The Conservative New Democracy Party won nearly 41% of the vote, but fell just short of a parliamentary majority. The left-wing Syriza Party performed unexpectedly poorly. Prime Minister Kyriakos Mitsotakis wants a second election in June, saying his party's been given a clear mandate to govern alone.
The
ballot results are decisive. They show that New Democracy has the approval of the people to rule, strong and autonomous. That is what voters asked for today, and they asked for it in an emphatic and absolute way. But they also asked us for something more, to move faster on the road of bold reforms.
Well, let's talk to our correspondent Evangelo Tsipsas in Athens. So, Evangelo, what was in the end a surprisingly good result for the Prime Minister Kyriakos Mitsotakis?
Yes, indeed. Himself, he didn't even expect that result, and his party either. They collected close to 41% of the total votes. There's been this map that has been going around from the Interior Ministry that shows the whole country in blue. Every single region and every single city in Greece the majority was won by the New Democracy Party, except of this little spot in northern Greece close to the border with Turkey. Now, this 40 points that the Prime Minister got, 20 points ahead of the second party that was the left-wing Syriza party. It was unexpected. A lot of the people weren't expecting it either. There was a lot of celebrations. People were so happy to see what happened. And now, of course, the Prime Minister, with this in his hand, now he's going to be going to perhaps a second round of elections with a different attitude and a leverage over the other political parties. Now, on the other side, the Syriza party, the mood there is very, very heavy as they have no idea what happened and what could have resulted to these poorly indications and points that they received. There's going to be a lot of discussions in their headquarters in the next few days to see who will continue to lead the party, as there have been rumors that the Alexis Tsipras might step down after the second round of elections.
So at the moment it looks like Greece is likely to be heading for a second vote in June. What's Mitsotakis hoping to achieve from that?
Well, he made it clear immediately after he got the percentage points that received the 41%. He said there will be no coalition government. We're going to go in a second round of elections, and we are asking for the Greek people to give us the majority to make this country stable again. That's what he was saying. He went today to the president of Greece, Katerina Sakelloropoulou, to get the order to start these coalition talks with the hope to form a coalition government. But as he made it clear, he's going to be returning very quick back sometime tonight to announce to her that we will be going to second round of elections. Now, if we go to the second round of elections, which is more likely, things change there. If he does receive, again, 40% of the votes, which correspond to about 145 to 147 seats, then he will receive an extra 40-seat bonus, which not only make him to form a government, but to form a majority-strong government. Now, these next elections will be taking place on June 25th, after it was announced earlier today from the Greek Prime Minister.
Evangelo, thank you very much. My correspondent Evangelo Tsipsas in Athens. At least 8 people have been wounded in a series of overnight airstrikes by Russian forces in eastern Ukraine. Officials say 16 different types of missiles were used in the attacks on the city of Dnipro and the surrounding area. The region's mayor says scores of buildings, including apartment blocks, were targeted, some by Iranian drones. Power has been restored to the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant after a shutdown triggered by a fire. Ukraine's state energy company says power lines were disconnected as a safety measure. It's the 7th time that power has been cut since it was seized by Russian troops over a year ago. The head of the UN's nuclear watchdog says the situation at Zaporizhzhia can't continue and that nuclear safety at the plant is extremely vulnerable. Ukraine says its forces are advancing on the centre of Bakhmut, aiming to encircle Russian troops who claim to have taken control of the city. The leader of the Wagner group of Russian-backed mercenaries said on Saturday that his men had captured Bakhmut, which has been at the centre of months of bitter warfare. Ukraine denies that it has lost control of the city. Well, let's talk to our correspondent, Stuart Smith, who is in Moscow. So, Stuart, what's the Kremlin saying about what's happening in Bakhmut?
Yeah, well, regardless of the picture on the ground, the Russian President Vladimir Putin thanked the Wagner private military company and the Russian Defense Ministry for taking Bakhmut, so it's certainly being presented here as a done deal. And even Yevgeny Prigozhin, the head of the Wagner private military company, says this week he's going to start removing his troops from Bakhmut, with all of them gone by the end of the month. As to where they will then go, we don't know yet. Wagner has other locations where it's active in Ukraine as well as other parts of the world, but certainly the way Yevgeny Prigozhin is talking is this is a done deal. He says that defensives have been set up on the west of the city, which would be the direction that any future Ukrainian armed forces would come from. So he seems confident, at least at the moment, that this is it. The other thing is that the Russian Ministry of Defense has said that it also agrees with Yevgeny Prigozhin. The city is taken, but as to the next steps, still we're not sure. We know this city was always important for Russia, not because of its strategic value in and of itself, but because what it would then be able to do later. It would allow Russian troops to then move towards even more significant locations. Once those locations are taken, the Russian Defense Ministry says it would effectively control all of Donetsk. So although Bakhmut may or may not have fallen, it is still being talked about as a major success on the road to, quote, liberating Donetsk.
And Stuart, we're hearing claims of Ukrainian ground troops inside Russia's Belgorod region. What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, this is really unusual. It's only happened really once before, and certainly not at this scale. But a group being described here in Moscow as a set of sabotage and reconnaissance groups of the Ukrainian armed forces have moved from the international border of Ukraine into Russia's Belgorod region, heavily shelled by Ukraine, sometimes individual sabotage attempts made there. But this is the first time such a major ground incursion has taken place. And the group, they say on their social media pages that is in Russia right now, it still seems, they say they are Russian citizens fighting for a, quote, free Russia, and they are there trying to, quote, liberate these Russian villages, of which they claim around 4 have been taken. It's not clear whether they intend to stay. Right now, the Russian Ministry of Defense says effectively they're dealing with it, that there are the resources required on the ground to get this sabotage and reconnaissance group to leave. But the consequences and the symbolism is quite clear. Ukraine says, although it says these are not Ukrainian troops, they are Russian civilians, it will be unclear from now on where along the Russia-Ukrainian border fighting could take place. Although we hear a lot about fighting inside Ukraine, some parts of the Ukrainian-Russian border are all quite quiet in terms of ground force movements, shelling on either side, but no threat of any breach. Now, along that whole 1,000-kilometre-plus long border, Russia could be concerned about future attacks.
Stuart, thank you very much. My correspondent Stuart Smith in Moscow. Facebook's owner Meta has been hit with a record fine under EU law for violations of user privacy. The $1.3 billion penalty was imposed by Ireland's Data Protection Commission and is the largest to be issued against a tech company under the bloc's General Data Protection Regulation privacy law. Ireland's data watchdog says Meta, which also owns Instagram and WhatsApp, was fined because it's continued to transfer user data to the United States, a breach of the rules. Meta says it will appeal against the ruling, which it has called flawed and unjustified. The company also says there will be no disruption to its services. In January, Meta was fined more than $420 million for not allowing users to opt out of personalised ads on Facebook. And last November, the company was fined $277 million after personal data belonging to more than 500,000 users was leaked. 2 months earlier, its social media platform Instagram received a penalty of $374 million for mishandling children's data. Well, Max Schrems is a privacy activist with the European Centre for Digital Rights. He was behind the original 2013 legal challenge against Facebook for failing to protect his privacy rights, a case which set off a decade of legal action. He has welcomed the ruling.
They could have had a penalty of more than $4 billion, and given that Facebook is actually illegally transferring data to the US for 10 years knowingly, and has really done nothing so far to limit that, the penalty could have probably been higher, or should have been higher. But it's a story that the Irish DPC, who is overlooking Facebook, is notoriously trying to kind of get these penalties down. Originally, they didn't want to have a penalty at all. It was like the European body that overlooks these decisions that then said that there has to be a penalty.
Now, stop sending data to the US. That's the message here to Meta. But if they and companies like them now have to fundamentally restructure their systems, will it still make business sense to operate in Europe?
It definitely does. I mean, Europe is the biggest market for Meta outside of the US, so there's no worry that they will go away. It's more of an issue of how to do it properly. And a lot of the big companies have tried to kind of keep data in Europe and make sure that they comply with the law. A lot of them have not fully succeeded on that, I also have to say. But Meta has not even given it a try. They basically said, we don't care what European law is and what the Court of Justice says in the European Union, and just continued with it anyways for about 10 years, despite being in the center of this whole storm.
Meta says that this ruling is flawed, unjustified, and sets a dangerous precedent. They're going to appeal, saying that the risk here is that the internet's going to get carved up. Well, what's your take?
Yeah, I mean, Meta is known to be overly dramatic, and it's almost like a high school kid being dramatic. The reality is that we do have the rules in Europe since 1995 that data has to stay in Europe unless you can guarantee that it's fully protected abroad. And that is the duty of these companies. They wanted that also with the new regulations that the companies should be in charge of securing privacy abroad when data goes abroad. And if they don't manage the consequences, that data cannot go abroad. And I think that's crystal clear. It was just very much ignored by especially big tech, but also the European regulators so far. They simply didn't enforce this law all too much. So yeah, I understand that they're dramatic, but it's not really overly sensible if you look at the law.
So what does all of this mean for your campaigning, and what would you like to see happen next?
I think what we need in the long run is that among democratic countries, at least, we would need some kind of no-spy agreement. So right now we agree on both sides of the Atlantic that surveillance, the way that the US does it, is a violation of fundamental rights. It would violate the Fourth Amendment in the US as well, your right to privacy under the US Constitution. The problem is that the US right now says that these rights are only guaranteed for Americans. So if data of another country goes there, they feel that they don't have any protections. And I think at least among democratic countries, we would need to have a common set of rules to say, okay, there has to be probable cause, there has to be a judge approving it, even if it's the data of a foreigner. And I think that is a bit what we'll need in the long run. In the short run, we'll probably have more data localization, that data simply cannot go abroad for the time being, which is not ideal, but the reality of how the laws kind of work together right now.
You're watching CGTN. Still ahead, Italy's Prime Minister tours northern regions devastated by flooding, promising financial support for their recovery. Welcome back. A reminder of our headlines. A second election looms for Greece as Prime Minister Kyriakos Mitsotakis wins Sunday's general election, fails to secure a majority. Ukraine says its troops are encircling Russian forces in the centre of besieged Bakhmut as both sides continue to claim control of the city. And Facebook owner Meta is hit with a record $1.3 billion fine for transferring user data from Europe to the United States. 3 Palestinian militants have been killed during an Israeli army raid at a West Bank refugee camp. Hours later, hundreds of Palestinians turned out for their funeral procession in the city of Nablus. The Israeli military said its forces came under fire from gunmen during the raid, which saw soldiers confiscate rifles and explosives, as well as destroying a bomb-making site. Residents of the Balata refugee camp said it was the largest Israeli operation there in years. A leading Belarus opposition activist who was sentenced to 8 years in jail earlier this month has been pardoned. 28-year-old blogger Roman Protasevich was arrested in 2021 when his Ryanair flight was forced to land in Minsk. He was found guilty of inciting terrorism and slandering Belarusian President Alexander Lukashenko. The former journalist says he has signed his release documents describing the pardon as great news. Negotiations on lifting the US debt ceiling are to resume as President Joe Biden returns from the G7 meeting in Japan. Ahead of talks to break the deadlock, Republican Kevin McCarthy said the pair had held a productive phone call. There are less than 2 weeks until the Treasury has warned that the country could be unable to pay its debt, something that would have global repercussions on prices and mortgage rates. The head of the World Health Organization has urged all countries to do more to prepare for future pandemics. Tedros Adhanom Ghebreyesus told the WHO's Health Assembly in Geneva that commitments on financing and reforms had to be honoured.
We cannot kick this can down the road. If we do not make the changes that must be made, then who will? And if we do not make them now, and when? When the next pandemic comes knocking, and it will, we must be ready to answer decisively, collectively, and equitably.
The 10-day meeting comes 2 weeks after the organisation officially declared an end to the COVID health emergency. Beijing has welcomed a decision by officials to exclude Taiwan from this year's meeting, despite lobbying by the island to join the talks. United States officials are in the Marshall Islands attempting to renew a strategic pact. The agreement would allow the US to retain responsibility for the island's defence and provide economic assistance. But lingering opposition to United States nuclear testing more than half a century ago threatens to stall the process. Our correspondent Greg Navarro reports.
There are numerous signs here of the United States' involvement in the Marshall Islands. It makes sense when you consider the Marshall Islands was a U.S. territory until the mid-1980s when it gained independence. The financial support from the United States has continued over the years. It is so significant now that it accounts for about 60% of this country's economy. So the public support for the United States because of that financial support is quite significant. There's also a fair amount of resentment among people of the testing, the U.S. testing 67 nuclear bombs in the 1950s and 60s. The fallout was immense. There are people that continue to suffer from the health and environmental impacts of that testing. In fact, last year, more than 100 environmentalists encouraged the United States government to formally apologize for that testing, as well as offer fair compensation.
The nuclear tribunal was established. It started funding the folks that were affected from nuclear. So until now, they haven't been paid. The total, I think, amount that haven't been paid to the nuclear folks is a total of $3.188 billion. That's the total amount that hasn't been funded to the folks affected by nuclear.
If we have money from US, they can help us. But we like US is good.
One government official we spoke with suggested the issue of fair compensation for the testing of nuclear bombs was a sticking point and one that was possibly holding up negotiations. The pact between the US and the Marshall Islands ends this year. Greg Navarro, CGTN, Majuro.
Italy's Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni has promised to support the recovery of areas hit by devastating flooding. She returned early from the G7 summit to visit some of the worst affected areas in the Emilia-Romagna region. At least 14 people have died and around 36,000 people have been forced to leave their homes. The damage is estimated to run into billions of dollars. It's the UN's International Day for Biological Diversity, and this year's theme is Building Back Biodiversity. One project that's trying to do just that centres on a species of horse that was extinct in its native China and Mongolia. But thanks to international breeding programmes, its population is now growing. Our correspondent Kitty Logan reports.
It's the only truly wild horse on Earth, but the Przewalski's horse counts on humans to help it survive. Breeding in captivity saved the species after it died out in its natural habitat. In the past, it was hunted and forced off land by human development. The species has made a remarkable comeback, but it's still classed as endangered. That means backup breeding at zoos must continue.
So these guys form basically an insurance population so that we can continue to bolster those populations out in the wild. So they're really important that they breed and we keep that population going.
Genetic diversity is also key for wild herds to grow. So this male foal born at Whipsnade Zoo is welcome news. And a newborn female has the potential to produce even more offspring in future.
It's a good season for this herd with 2 foals born in recent weeks. This helps boost the wider European breeding programme, but it also is vitally important to protect the species as a whole worldwide.
Unique, untamed, yet shorter than a domestic horse, the Przewalski's horse has 2 extra chromosomes which set it apart. The species was successfully reintroduced from zoos to reserves in Mongolia and China in the early 90s. Chinese researchers work alongside international zoos to monitor the horse's progress. Numbers are increasing here in China and across the border in Mongolia.
They are not extinct, but they are extinct in the wild because they only survive in captivity with human help. So that's the stage we're at.
So there are challenges still for the Przewalski's horse as it re-establishes in the wild. It needs supplementary feeds as natural food sources dwindle in winter.
These zoo animals are kind of trying to readapt back to its original native habitat because we have like extreme drought, we have very heavy winter with very low temperature.
Conservationists trying to protect the species say the horses suffer from more extreme weather linked to climate change. They're also vulnerable to disease, parasites, and are affected by habitat loss, meaning they still need protection.
We actually still need to support that population because not all of those problems are straight away solved. Their habitat has still been made much smaller by expansion of human agriculture than it was previously for them to have those resources to be able to survive.
The hope is for these foals to eventually reproduce and help further increase numbers. That should secure a future for this species for many more generations to come. Kitty Logan, CGTN, at Whipsnade Zoo.
The art of tea and its deep cultural roots are being celebrated for the first time in China. Our correspondent Zhou Jiaxin explores the heritage of growing the crop and drinking its leaves.
Tea has delighted and fascinated the world for millennia. From trade and culture to aesthetics, these you can experience at the ongoing tea festival in Beijing.
Tea is ubiquitous in Chinese people's daily lives. Steeped boiled tea is served in homes, workplaces, restaurants, and tea houses. Now, the traditional tea processing techniques and their social practices were added to the UNESCO list last November. Mr. Liang, would you please share with us what is special about this intangible cultural heritage?
Chinese techniques are very important. Handicrafts matter. They're passed down by generations. Diplomatic envoys from Chinese dynasties made tea and tea culture known globally, and the techniques were the key to the popularity of this fine drink.
Tea producers outside China, like New Zealand, are also coming in.
The bar is set very, very high in terms of tea quality, and especially in the importance of tea in China. So I love the Chinese tea culture. I think anything that can bring people together is a wonderful thing.
In China, tea is no longer just a beverage. It's now become an aesthetic experience.
This tea table was created using the colors green and blue. It was then decorated with traditional flower arrangements and glazed teaware. This is how aesthetics come into play. And I no longer prepare tea by pouring it over a line of teacups. Instead, I make tea specifically for each cup, which satisfies both the aesthetics of life and the status of literati gathering.
This is not tea stone, it is tea's ton, branding the tea serving thing with innovative color in tea sets, as well as ways for drinkers to learn more about tea culture.
The traditional Chinese Eve has inspired the design of our tea stores. The expression of wood color and traditional utensils cater to young people's liking. We also select and display fine products from China's 6 types of tea as a mini museum.
With the theme of sharing a cup of tea with the world, the festival offers China's new ideas in preserving and enhancing its traditional culture, one sip at a time. Zhou Jiaxing, CGTN, Beijing.
A spacecraft carrying the first female astronaut from Saudi Arabia has reached the International Space Station.
And liftoff, Falcon 9, go Axiom.
Together we expand what is
SpaceX's Falcon rocket blasted off from Florida carrying a crew of 4, only the second all-private astronaut mission to the ISS. 2 of the crew are from Saudi Arabia, including Rayana Barnawi, a specialist in cancer stem cell research. She sent greetings from orbit.
Hello from outer space. It feels amazing to be viewing Earth from this capsule. Thanks to all SST and whoever worked with them, Axiom, SpaceX, NASA, JAXA, ESA, all the trainers. Special thanks goes to my grandmothers and to my awesome family and friends. And to the people around the world, well, the future is very bright. And I would like you to dream big, believe in yourselves, and believe in humanity.
Barnawi will conduct experiments on breast cancer research during the 8-day mission. The participation of both Saudi astronauts was sponsored by the Saudi government, while the crew also includes a private fee-paying participant, John Schaffner. Well, we're now going to take you around 400 kilometres up above Earth, where we can look at some live pictures from the International Space Station now, where one of the crew is trying to connect that recently arrived Dragon module to the ISS. We expect in the next few hours we will see the crew exiting that newly arrived rocket and entering the International Space Station, where there will be a welcome ceremony in a few hours' time. Our main stories again. A second election looms for Greece as Prime Minister Kyriakos Mitsotakis wins Sunday's general election but fails to secure a majority. Ukraine says its troops are encircling Russian forces in the centre of besieged Bakhmut as both sides continue to claim control of the city. And Facebook owner Meta is hit with a record $1.3 billion fine for transferring user data from Europe to the United States. And that is the world today. Thanks for watching. There's more news on CGTN Europe's channel on the Telegram app, or scan the QR code on the screen to get stories and updates sent direct to your phone. We're back with more news at the top of the hour. Coming up next, it's World Insight. For now, from all of the team in London, it's goodbye.